So tonight's lecture is the John L. Loeb Professor of Germanic Languages and Literature at Harvard University, where she chairs the program in Folklore and Mythology. So many of you might ask, how do Germanic languages link to gateway to reading? Well, the Washington Post, in a review of one of her books, posed a similar question and answered it this way. In fact, Maria Tatar may be our leading scholar of children's literature and of the fairy tale in particular. Maria Tatar is the author of the classic fairy tales, the Annotated Grimm brothers, the Annotated Peter Pan. She is a frequent contributor to the New Yorker and the New York Times. It has been said about her 2009 book, Enchanted Hunters, it transforms our understanding of why children should read. She is currently working on a volume of African American folktales, and it gives me a great pleasure to welcome Maria Tatar to the Boston Public Library.
Thank you. It's just a great honor to be here at a site that is the holy grail for many in the Boston area. And before we move on to the attractions of carnage, I want to tip my hat to the library in the town where I grew up. And if I could have the next image, it will show you the Highland Park Public Library. And this is just a pale representation of how I remember it. The image in my mind's eye is of a building, a gigantic building with polished mahogany doors and bright golden hinges. And when you walk through it, it was as if there was an azure curtain with silvery stars on it. And it was just the place where the action was when I was growing up, a place that became a second home for me. I came to the United States, and if you can see, here's my naturalization card. I came to the United States as an immigrant, and in those days the INS referred to us as, if you can read the fine print, it refers to me as a resident alien, a displaced person. And you will see that I am threatened with deportation in case I fail to report my address change, something that always worried me. So I told my parents on an annual basis that they absolutely must, anytime we moved, report that change of address. I love the idea, too, of a naturalized citizen and the way that we have this whole discursive apparatus for describing immigrants. Well, the library was the place that I could wander, explore, and witness. It was full of adventures for me. And it was also a space where nobody judged me, where nobody worried about my hand-me-downs or about the strange accents that my parents had. And it taught me that the consolations of imagination are not by any stretch of the imagination imaginary consolations. So there was my experience in the library, and it was a glorious one, and it brought me here to this library to talk about something that has haunted me really for several decades now. Why is there so much violence in children's literature? And if we could have the next image. This is a question that I'm repeatedly asked, and I've provided a host of answers, many of them unsatisfactory to me. So this seemed like a great opportunity to really reflect on that question, to think hard about how, in some ways, it's not just the beauty of stories, but also the violence in stories that turns children from reluctant readers, if I can use some of the wording from the advertisements for these lectures, that turns children from reluctant readers into voracious bookworms, into addicts and gluttons and kids who always have their nose in a book. I'm always astonished by these terrible metaphors that we use for avid child readers, bookworms. And I remember I hated it when people referred to me as always having my nose in a book. So what about the attractions of melodrama, of violence in children's literature? Do violent delights, and that's Shakespeare's term, do violent delights desensitize or do they incite? You can ask the question, are they mimetic? Do they inspire people to imitate what is in them? Is the violence cathartic? Is it ritualized or random? And I'm going to narrow that down somewhat to the question in my title, looking at cautionary tales, also at revenge fantasies, and finally at solidarity narratives. And that's where the empathy will come in. So we're going to be moving actually historically through three different phases of children's literature. The cautionary, the cathartic, and then finally the empathetic model. So here, some of you may be familiar with Saving Mr. Banks, and in that film, Pamela Travers asks a befuddled Walt Disney, where is the gravitas? Now, this is a film that reminds us that there are really two radically different approaches when it comes to producing entertainments for children. And what I love about the film is that it gives us a little tutorial on what is the best way to write for a child. So on the one hand, there are the generic Disney entertainments, and these are sanitized confections designed really to lure us into complacency and also consumption. So if we look at our next image, you will see here all of those goofy animals, cute little animals, sometimes not so cute. You see the generic pastel princesses and all their diversity and all their advertised diversity. And then these alarmingly bland princesses, and all of these princesses, animals sing their way, dance and sing their way from first world problems to happily ever after. So these are the stories, and you can see how all of it also leads to consumption. That is, the fantasy, the ideal that you're led to, the goal is the happily ever after wedding in Disneyland, complete with coach and footman. So these are the stories that prompted Jean Baudrillard to denounce the whole Disney philosophy and how it eats out of your hand with these pretty little sentimental creatures in gray fur coats. For my part, he added, I believe that behind these smiling eyes there lurks a cold, ferocious beast fearfully stalking us. Sugarcoating, I think, gets an entirely new depth of meaning here. And suddenly we begin to see the beast that is lurking beneath these banalities. So we have then, on the one hand, the Disney philosophy, and then on the other hand, the school that pulls no punches at all and just gives us the facts, the hard facts, and sometimes with more of a dollop of gravitas than most people want for the very young. So at the extreme end of that spectrum, you'll find, and if I could get the next image, you will find books like Doris Sanford's Don't Make Me Go Back, Mommy, a child's book about satanic ritual abuse. And I am not making this isn't some sort of internet joke. I actually ordered the book and have it here in case anyone wants to look at it. There's Melissa Higgins, The Night Dad Went to Jail. And there is Mary Kate Jordan's Losing Uncle Tim, which I didn't put up there, in addition to My Big Sister Takes Drugs and all of that. Mary Kate Jordan's Losing Uncle Tim, which is a book about a boy whose beloved uncle succumbs to AIDS. Now, some of these titles, and when I've shown them in class, they often provoke a kind of reflex laugh, but it's a nervous one because these things do happen. And so they trigger, in the end, sympathy for the authors rather than contempt for foisting this kind of stuff on children. The books may seem over the top, but they capture real-life trauma in their titles, and they stage tragic plots that have undeniably invaded the lives of children. So why then would we want to banish those stories? Our next slide brings us back to Walt and Pamela, and their views really mirror the bifurcation of opinions in the field of children's literature. And we have protectionists on the one side, Walt Disney, and then emancipators like Pamela Travers on the other side. Real life is fairly miserable, Rousseau told parents, and we have an obligation to indulge and protect the young. Love childhood, he wrote in his educational tract, Emile. Promote its games, its pleasures, its amiable instinct. And that's exactly what Walt Disney would say. Travers, on the other hand, doesn't want any sugarcoating. She thinks that we should teach children about the grim horrors in their own lives, as well as in the lives of others. Now, this is a Disney production, so guess who wins? And, you know, as you look at the two of them, you see Walt connecting with people, affable, likable, out in Disneyland, and there she is, rather hostile and grim. But it's important to point out Mary Poppins does not exactly belong to the hard facts school of children's literature. And Disney entertainments, as we know from all those charismatic, wicked figures, and our next slide will show them, to look at them all. They're always dressed in purple and black with a touch of gold, and they give us a lot more than spoonfuls of sugar. They are the charismatic. I remember seeing Snow White as a child and being completely under the spell of the wicked queen, who has this fabulous underground lair with books and crows and skulls and all of these mysterious things. So Saving Mr. Banks offers a great little tutorial, as I said, on the high stakes in the game of writing for children. And it reminds us in its title, as elsewhere in the film, that the redemption of adults may be the real goal sought by authors of children's books. It's all about saving Mr. Banks rather than the Banks children. In other words, we as adults have some skin in the game, and the stories we tell children are often for our own good as much as for their own good, even if we're, of course, the ones who administer the sugar and the medicine. So today what I want to do is look mainly at the medicine, the bitter pills that we ask children to swallow, and I want to probe stories that make direct visceral hits, giving us the chills, sending tingles up our spines, and making the hair on the nape of our necks stand up. These tales really evoke a somatic response, and in many ways, they have what Paul Ricoeur refers to as ontological vehemence. They give us a real kick. And if I could have the next slide. The once upon a time of fairy tales, and also of much of fantasy, gives us a wonderful split reference. And I love that phrase, Majorcan storytellers, and storytellers from other parts of the world as well, who begin with, it was and it was not. Once upon a time, it was not. It was, it actually occurred. But that's a faraway time, so this isn't the here and now. So Ricoeur emphasizes the same kind of split reference in metaphorical truth. Metaphor may be just language, but it also has a certain ontological vehemence or iconic solidity. Metaphors enable us to see. They animate, they vivify, and they give us the illusion of the real. And you can see here what he tells us about how metaphor is living not only to the extent that it vivifies a constituted language. Metaphor is living by virtue of the fact that it introduces the spark of imagination into a thinking more at the conceptual level. This struggle to think more, guided by the vivifying principle, is the soul of interpretation. And, if you start to reflect on some of the metaphors and tropes, and I've listed just a few that I came across in the last few days. Picasso, art washes away the dust of everyday life. Suddenly, you are animated by those words. Bob Dylan, chaos is a friend of mine. Here's my favorite, Groucho Marx, a hospital bed is a parked taxi with the meter running. So all at once, not only do we start to visualize things, but we also fill in the blanks. We begin to think more. Because fairy tales and many children's books are, in a way, extended metaphors, exaggerating and intensifying figures of speech, my mother is like an ogre becomes my stepmother is an ogre. My father is a giant bully becomes there's a giant at the top of the beanstalk and he wants to kill me. Because of that, we need to think hard about monsters and the violence they inflict in fairy tales. Children may understand that they are in Once Upon a Time, but the events in those tales may still feel very real. And in this context, I always think of Dumbledore, who tells Harry Potter, just because it's happening in your head doesn't mean that it's not real. Which I think makes the question of horror and violence in stories all the more acute. Why are these stories so violent? Should we expose children to the violence in fairy tales, for example, especially because it may seem so real to us, to them? There's invariably disappointment when I fail to come up with a one-liner or a punched-up soundbite to those questions. So over the years, I've learned to have one handy because no one wants to hear that it's complicated, or that this golden nugget of wisdom may have multiple facets, along with a certain kind of dense opacity. What we all know is that understanding violence in literature requires three-dimensional thinking, connecting dots and tracing multiple pathways from authors and words on a page to readers who are also in different times and cultures. So I want to go back to those three models, and I'm going to sketch out these three different models, showing how violence comes to be instrumentalized in children's literature. The first in this trio is the cautionary tale, tableaus of torture that are bent on civilizing children, turning what Freud referred to as the cauldron of seething emotions that is the child's mind into something that is slightly less turbid, slightly less bubbly and messy. And what I want to do here is take up Little Red Riding Hood and also a collection of stories called Struwwelpeter, which some of you may know by that title or as Shock-Headed Peter. And just look at a series of or else stories. I always call them or else stories instead of the great what ifs. This is not about adventure and exploration, but about discipline and punishment. These are or else tales that warn children about the consequences of disobedience, curiosity, and all those other traits that deviate from the adult agenda of civilizing and taming the young and the restless. Second category, revenge fantasies. They give us just the opposite of the cautionary tale. But here again, we have these scenes of punishment that are staged. But now the child, who is always in an asymmetrical relationship, an asymmetrical power relationship with adults, the child turns the table on his or her grown-up adversaries. And here you can think of Snow White and how the wicked queen dances to death in her red-hot iron shoes, while the heroine lives happily ever after. And we all know what happens to the witch in Hansel and Gretel. Cinderella's stepsisters, at least in the Grimm's version of the story, are attacked by doves. When they enter the church, their right eyes are pecked out. When they leave the church, their left eyes are pecked out. So if cautionary tales are supremely satisfying to adults, in part because the hope is that they'll create a kind of docile, obedient child, tales about getting even are supremely satisfying to children who often don't care at all that the stepmother in the juniper tree is crushed to death by a millstone. They don't seem to mind that. So moving from revenge tales, cautionary tales, revenge tales, and now to solidarity narratives, this is my third type. And these are stories that recruit us as witnesses to suffering. And they enable us to binge on empathy and to purge our fears. Language does not run dry, as Virginia Woolf famously told us about representing pain. Instead, it feeds on itself, creating a kind of sensory overload. And the best example for this, I think, is Hans Christian Andersen's Little Match Girl, where we get a long description of the dead little girl lying on the sidewalk on New Year's Eve, and we see, her pale cheeks, the cold corpse, and all of that. And this is a book that we still reissue in the holiday season. For these kinds of tales, we could invoke Elaine Scarry's Body in Pain with its positioning of pain as a process of unmaking the world. But we can also take up the question of whether these stories are truly a moral technology. And that's the view of Steven Pinker in a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature. Or whether they simply perpetuate stereotypes and promote oppressive social structures. Do they change what is inside and therefore affect what is outside of us, the lives of others? Or do they turn us into voyeurs, indulging in the guilty pleasure of witnessing the misery of others? So let's begin with the cautionary tale and the quintessential story of a parental prohibition and its violation. This is the story of Little Red Riding Hood. It's a tale that once circulated in adult versions, as we know from folklorists who collected a version in the 19th century, which features a big bad wolf who kills grandmother, slices up her flesh and puts it on a platter, puts her blood into a bottle. The girl arrives, sees dinner on the table, eats it up, and then goes over to Granny's bed and performs a little striptease. The wolf enumerates each article of clothing, telling the girl to take it off. She won't need it. She won't be needing it anymore. So there's no litany of exclamations about what big teeth you have, what big eyes you have, what a big mouth you have. Just this little cannibalistic feast followed by the striptease. So the girl has a good sense to recognize that the creature in Granny's bed is actually a wolf, and she engineers her escape by telling the wolf that she has to go outside to relieve herself. And she does that and runs back home. So she's what the folklorists call a trickster figure who doesn't need a huntsman or anyone else to liberate her. This tale doesn't end with a moral, with a message, with anything, just with the girl hightailing it home and the disappointed wolf lying in bed, hungry, abandoned, and probably feeling rather foolish in Granny's nightgown. It may seem as if this story has slipped away from us completely and has been replaced by the Grimm's version of the story. It's an adult version. It has more than the whiff of the archaic. But in fact, this version of Little Red Riding Hood flashes out at us all the time. And if we could go back just 2 images, one more. There we go. We have here Tex Avery's Red Hot Riding Hood, a film with the girl in red you can see isn't wearing much. She's got a rather skimpy outfit, and she has a burlesque routine in a nightclub. Little Red Riding Hood and the Wolf dance a tango of innocence and seduction in a variety of films, some of which I put up: Freeway, Hard Candy. There's also The Company of Wolves, which I don't have up here. And some of you may know Hannah, where the girl is actually dressed up as the wolf. She's a genetically modified teenage assassin who reads Little Red Riding Hood at night, and she's not so stupid as to wear red in the woods. So these are all R-rated films. We also find that the two figures dance a flirtatious duo in various advertisements for everything from perfume and aftershave to Pepsi and hot chocolate. So uninhibited in their staging of body humor and sultry seductions, these refashionings transform the predator-prey relationship into a fraught battle of the sexes, at times playful, as in Red Hot Riding Hood, at times homicidal, as in the frightening Hard Candy, but at times both, as in Little Red Riding Crop in the upper right there. Now, side by side with a Little Red Riding Hood who can be as seductive and violent as the wolf is a Little Red Riding Hood who is what Anne Sexton refers to as a dumb bunny. And her tale tells a lesson, and it gives us repetition compulsion on steroids. The tale bifurcates dramatically, as you can see. You've seen the adult versions here, and now come the child-friendly ones. And here is Trina Schardt-Hyman's Little Red Riding Hood. And we can go back to the Grimms, who end their tale with not just a moral set aside, but with the little girl having internalized the lesson and reciting it to herself and also to the child outside the book. The Grimm's moral, Little Red Riding Hood, says, "I will never again stray from the path when mother has forbidden it." Now, one of the things I did was one day I ordered from Amazon all the Little Red Riding Hood picture books I could find, and I discovered that almost 90% of them end with something like this: "I will never wander off the forest path again as long as I live. I should have kept my promise to mother." So even the most subversive writers, even the ones who use humor and whimsy, end up giving us the same old story, as if straying from the path would somehow saved the girl from the predator in the woods. Never mind the fact that the lesson is one that we don't necessarily want to transmit to children today. So we have the wonderful Neil Gaiman in our next image. In The Ocean at the End of the Lane, he tells us, children use back ways and hidden paths. Adults take roads and official paths. And today, I think, even though, Little Red Riding Hood can be seen as a book about stranger danger, there is a way in which we embrace the notion of straying from the path, encouraging children to take Gaiman's back ways and hidden paths. And still we persist in condemning that activity in a story that nearly everyone hears in one version or another as a child. So the point I want to make here is that what folklorists refer to as the multiforms of Little Red Riding Hood are not all cautionary tales. But the ones we tell to children feel obliged to point a moral, resisting the notion that the tale might engage with a range of cultural binaries beyond subordination and insubordination. The tale also engages with the predator-prey relationship, the nature-culture divide, and the fraught tension between innocence and seduction. So if I can invoke Rousseau again, Rousseau tells us that children are contrarians. Follow children learning their fables, and when you see them in a position to apply their lessons, they almost always do so in a way opposite to the author's intention. Instead of looking within themselves for the shortcoming that one wants to cure or prevent, they tend to like the vice used to take advantage of shortcomings. And suddenly, it dawns on us that the child listening to Little Red Riding Hood might well recognize the advantages of being a predator and end up identifying with who else but the wolf. Particularly in the French version, in Charles Perrault's version, which is still told in France to small children today, which the girl ends up in the belly of the wolf. She never makes it out. So you can see how a child would not want to identify with the girl in the belly of the wolf. Ritual violence, as we know from Michel Foucault, can quickly turn from a cautionary warning to carnivalesque anarchy. And that's precisely why Dr. Heinrich Hoffmann's Struwwelpeter, with its cover image, and we'll go from Neil Gaiman to Struwwelpeter in the next image, its cover image of what appears to be an almost feral child, and with its interior fables about the tragic ends of children who suck their thumbs, play with matches, or fail to eat their soup, is subtitled Lustige Geschichten und drollige Bilder. That is, amusing stories and funny pictures. And this is a book that was targeted by Dr. Hoffmann, who was a pediatrician, and wanted to have some books in his waiting room that would not be boring. And so he created this picture book, and our next image will show us some of these amusing stories and funny pictures. Maybe not so fun. Pauline plays with matches and goes up in flames, and you can see her cats are appalled. And the next image shows us her gravestone with the cats mourning her. Can we go back one? Yes, and there is Conrad the Thumbsucker. His mother goes out, runs some errands, and she says, "Conrad, don't suck your thumb." And of course, he puts his thumb in his mouth, and then this tailor comes running out with these gigantic shears, and the last image is of Conrad standing there with the two thumbs lopped off. And there is a boy, first anorexic child in literature, who decides not to eat his soup and ends up in the cemetery, as you can see. So despite the fact that many of these juvenile protagonists end up in the graveyard, the volume has endured, oddly because the stories entertain as much as they frighten. Moving in the mode of what James Twitchell has called preposterous violence, they present children with figures of excess so exaggerated, distorted, and grotesque that they can't really be taken seriously. We're in the realm of Roadrunner, flattened on the highway, or Sylvester the Cat, who falls down 15 stories. And I'm reminded here of a terrible film that I saw last week with Robert De Niro and Michelle Pfeiffer. It's called The Family. And it's nothing, it is a little bit like Roadrunner, with constant scenes of violence and revenge, a little bit like Battle Royale, relentless revenge scenes. Now, given the elasticity of Little Red Riding Hood, it's easy enough to imagine how that story can actually transform itself from a cautionary tale to a revenge fantasy, to our second category. The relationship of predator-prey and villain-victim can be reversed in an instant in fairy tales. Suddenly, the weak and seemingly powerless turn the tables on the strong and mighty. The Grimms, in fact, collected one version of Little Red Riding Hood in which Granny and the girl turn the tables on the wolf. They outwit the greedy wolf. These are the stories that Malcolm Gladwell celebrates in his book David and Goliath, Underdogs, Misfits, and the Art of Battling Giants. And this is a volume that uses biblical narratives rather than fairy tales to reveal how small and smart can outwit the lumbering and the obtuse. If tales once told around the fireside to multi-generational audiences, sort of like that Little Red Riding Hood story I told earlier, if they end most frequently with the triumph of the underdog, showing the power of wit, wisdom, and courage, tales with child protagonists took two different paths, one tilted toward a disciplinary agenda, the other to an empowering mode, providing a tutorial for defeating monsters. Hansel and Gretel is a story that takes that turn, giving us the quintessential revenge fantasy, one that I think shows children the tools that they need to defeat monsters and find a way back home. No fairy tale takes us deeper into the woods than the Grimm's Hansel and Gretel. Its forests are compounded of dread and desire, offering a double thrill as the children face down the terrors and seductions of a house made of bread and cake, with windows of sparkling sugar guarded by a cannibalistic host. Living in a time of famine, the children are already famished when abandoned by their father. And they meet up with the witch in the woods. And I think we can look at our next image here, Hansel and Gretel greeting the children from her edible house in the dark woods. The witch has ensured that the story will not go away and that it continues to be reimagined today at the operas, in the movies, in ads. Some of you are probably familiar with the dreadful Hansel and Gretel Witch Hunters, where the children have grown up and take their revenge now on the witch. But there's more to the story than breathtakingly scary witches and mouth-watering baked goods that surround them. In the many illustrations, they perform the cultural work of imagining what must be both a worst case and a best case possible scenario for any young child. And let's look at our next image, which will show us some of the wonderful illustrations to this story. And you can see how they combine beauty and horror, these delightful houses, and then the creepy witch who embodies what Derrida calls hospitality, a mix of hostility and hospitality, that is, with this attractive house, and at the same time she's going to prepare them for her own feast. Hansel and Gretel, I think, become models of heroic fairy tale behavior, learning step by step how to survive and find a way out of the woods. And they come to be linked through the development of incremental knowledge in times of famine with the classic trickster figure of folklore and mythology. Hunger and loss drive them to improvise, to discover strategies for survival, and to find a way out of the woods. Not unlike cinematic siblings, real and faux, ranging from, and you'll see them in the next image, Lex and Tim in Jurassic Park, and Katniss and Peeta in the Hunger Games. I think that's Gale, Katniss and Gale. But there we have Lex and Tim, who are in a kitchen being pursued by predators, raptors in this case, and remember they're all female. And at one point they use the oven actually to escape from these predators, and it's Lex who manages to save the day because of her command of computer language. And then here we have Katniss, who looks remarkably like Gretel in this wonderful illustration for Hansel and Gretel by Arthur Rackham. Confronting the evils of parental abandonment and the threat of cannibalistic aggression, the children, Hansel and Gretel, learn how to outwit their antagonists and discover a way home. And if I could have the next image, here's where we're going to move from that wonderful house and the wicked witch to the children. And you'll notice that the story, I remember always being annoyed by the fact that Gretel keeps keeps crying, keeps sitting down and crying. And Hansel is the one who takes the lead at the beginning of the story. And in our next image, I've tried to capture the steps that they take to move from the innocence of childhood. They are unknowing children to the status of the trickster. And what do? They begin, they're so shrewd, they understand the power of language. So what do they do at night? They're so hungry that they can't sleep. They listen to their parents. They hear the plot that the parents are hatching to abandon them. And then Hansel is the one who uses those pebbles. He puts them down on the path, and then he lies to his stepmother. He tells her that he's just looking back at the cat who is on the roof. The stepmother then outwits him, and he has to resort to those breadcrumbs which are eaten up by the birds. And then remember the children at the house, they're starving, so of course they start eating bits and pieces of the house, pulling down pieces of the roof. And when they hear a voice saying, "Nibble, nibble, little mouse, who's that nibbling on my house?" they lie. They say, the wind, the heavenly child. And then they outwit the witch. First, Hansel uses a bone to try to show the witch that he's still too thin to be put into the oven. And then Gretel, who has always been positioned behind Hansel, suddenly takes the lead. She's still behind, but what does she do? She asks the witch, when the witch tells her to get into the oven, she tells the witch, she acts dumb, she plays stupid, and she says, "How do I do that?" And the witch pantomimes it for her, and then Gretel pushes her into the oven. Now, the children then turn from liars into thieves, and what do? They steal the jewels in that hut, and then they're faced with another challenge, which is to cross the pond that is separating them from home. And at that point, Gretel uses words. She chants. She uses an enchantment. She uses poetry to summon a duck, which then carries the two children across the waters. So you can see how their status as liars, thieves, boundary crossers, and poets puts them in proximity to, and if I could have the last slide, maybe in dialogue with the figure of Hermes, who is also affiliated with speech, interpretation, messages. He is the messenger of the gods. And here's just, you can take a look at this little refresher course about Hermes, who is also a trickster, a liar, a thief, and an enchanter. So just as Hermes begins his career with theft and lies and ends it with charms and enchantments, so too the actions of the children in the Grimm's tale mingle duplicity with art, showing how misrepresentation and appropriation are not just survival strategies, but also the crucial first steps toward the creation of poetry, art, and other enchantments. So, studying violence in fairy tales requires us to consider a third type of narrative, one that could be put into a category that Freud developed in his essay called "A Child is Being Beaten." And here I want to turn to Andersen's Little Match Girl, who not only dies, ends as a corpse on the sidewalk, but she's also beaten by her father when she doesn't bring in enough revenue. So I want to consider The Little Match Girl. This is a story that does not stage a deserved punishment, and it doesn't indulge in enacting revenge fantasies. What we have here is a scene of suffering, a tableau designed to evoke compassion rather than enunciate a program for survival. In the past decade, there's been much made of the capacity of reading to promote empathy and emotional intelligence. In experiments conducted by Emmanuel Castano and David Kidd, subjects who read extracts from sophisticated literary works scored much higher than those who read nonfiction on tests measuring the ability to imagine the lives of others and also to imagine the mental states of others. This is a kind of experiment, I think, that would have been unthinkable in the last century. Today, we live in what Steven Pinker has called an age of empathy, with dozens of books on why empathy matters, on the neuroscience of empathy, on the empathy gap, and so on and so forth. Last week I was reading the wonderful Empathy Exams by Leslie Jamison. Now, the headline in those experiments was not so much that reading fiction makes us more compassionate, but that witnessing the sufferings of both real people as well as fictional characters animates our sense of sympathy. What the historian Lynn Hunt tells us about novels, they promote new forms of empathetic identification with individuals who are now imagined to be in some fundamental way like you, seems to hold true. She confirms what George Eliot told us back in 1856, that art is the nearest thing to life. It's a mode of amplifying experience and extending our contact with our fellow men beyond the grounds of our personal lot. Walking in someone else's shoes, getting inside someone's head, feeling their pain, these phrases illustrate just how easy it is for us to slide into a relationship of sympathetic identification with others. So, to conclude, the cautionary tale has lost much of its traction over the course of the last 200 years. We no longer discourage children from sucking their thumbs by reading them stories about sliced off digits. Nor do we end our versions of Little Red Riding Hood with the girl in the belly of the wolf. And we're also reluctant to expose children to revenge fantasies, as becomes evident in our recastings of Hansel and Gretel and of Snow White. Gretel may still shove the witch into the oven, but we don't hear her howls and shrieks of pain as in the Grimm's tale. And sometimes Gretel just outsmarts her. The wicked queen also, in Snow White, no longer dances to death in red-hot iron shoes. The predators, monsters, and villains of folklore that once haunted our imagination and were gleefully dispatched in scenes of torture have, in many cases, turned into our cultural heroes. Wicked, Gregory Maguire's Wicked, Maleficent, a film which I think is about to be released, Beast, Shrek. Suddenly, the villains are our heroes. Our relationship to alterity has changed so profoundly that our wolves reveal themselves as victims. Beasts prove superior to humans, and witches end up as the target of our sympathy. But just as Baudrillard detected the fault lines in defanged Disney hyper-realities, so too we can run certain risks in assimilating the other and discarding revenge fantasies. Monstrosity has long been a trope for invasion and contamination, serving as a powerful machine of exclusion and scapegoating. Difference turns into deviance and is pathologized. But monsters, as Jeffrey Cohen tells us, are also our children. They can be pushed to the farthest margins of geographical discourse, hidden away at the edges of the world and in the forbidden recesses of our mind, but they always return. And when they come back, they ask us why we have created them. So revenge tales may not be so terrible after all, because they do enable us to confront our own darkest fears and desires and then try to figure out why we created them, how we created them. And beyond that, they move us into an epistemophilic mode. I love that word. It's the love of knowledge, the love of reading that I referred to earlier, what took me into the library day after day. They are stories about monsters create curiosity about their origins and causes. Ralph Waldo Emerson told us long ago that beasts and monsters are one of the keys by which we found out the secrets of our nature. They are our test objects. And for that reason alone, I would say, it may be problematic to drive all those monsters out of the stories we tell children. Thanks very much.